let me introduce Professor Juan Carlos De Martin, which is one of my colleagues from Politecnico in Torino, but in particular is a founder of the Nexa Center, and he will tell you why open.
Thank you. Thank you also for this invitation at this conference. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, for a long time I worked and I still work in the area of open something. In the 2003 and 2004, we introduced, me and a law professor in Torino, introduced the Creative Commons licenses in Italy. Okay, Vado. Okay, let's try again. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this important topic. I've chosen this title, Why Open, because for many years I just, wow. Okay. Take three. I chose this title with a question mark, why open? Because for many years I've been involved with the open access movement in a broad sense. So we introduced Creative Commons in Italy now many years ago, in 2003, 2004, and I've been involved with open source, I've been involved with open access, I've been involved with open educational resources, etc. Open, 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 open. And at some point in the past few years, also in the process of thinking about university for a book that came out just a few months ago, I had to step back and to ask myself a bit more critically about the word open. Not to renounce the word open, but just to put it in a context, in a broader context, and to give it the proper weight and the proper meaning. So that's why what I would like to do with you today is to think about open in this context. And the starting point, of course, is the so-called digital revolution, therefore the profound transformation due to digital technology that we're witnessing in many areas of human activity. A beloved word of Silicon Valley is disruption, which is one of those words that gets annoying over time. But it's true that the digital revolution has produced disruption and different ways of doing business and doing things in many industries, like the music industry, the newspapers industry, in politics, and many other fields of activity. For people like me that study the impact of the digital revolution, we actually studied this. So sociologists, engineers like me, economists, law professors, they try to understand what is the impact of the digital revolution in different areas of activity. But the digital revolution also affects us. And therefore, a few years ago, actually now almost 10 years ago, I started thinking, well, what about the impact of the digital revolution on my profession and my institution and my activity? So exactly like in all other areas, the digital revolution, like all profound transformation, forces you to go back to your roots and to understand exactly what are you trying to achieve with a given institution or with a given business model. So actually you end up with philosophy, you end up reflecting about your own motivations. And therefore I ended up, and other people like me ended up asking, okay, but what is then the role of university in society? Which is actually a question that seems obvious, but it's not at all. What does it mean to be a professor in the digital age? What does it change? Does anything changes? Anything new or not? What it means to be a student in a digital age? We tend to think about university and tend to think about the professor, but we also have to think about the students. What does it mean to be a student? And I would always say in passing that being a student is not being a customer. It's a profound difference. What is teaching? What is is teaching about? So actually, very old questions that we have to ask ourselves again. I'll keep it like this, otherwise it doesn't work. And these are questions that we as professors, as students, as staff, as librarians, we ought to ask, we must ask, because otherwise somebody else will ask these questions for us and give answers that maybe we do not actually share, we do not actually like. And so this is my way of approaching the issue, is that we have to think about these fundamental questions and think about what it means to be a university in the 21st century, what it means to be a professor, what is teaching, etc. And then when we have convincing answers, and the answers may vary, but I try to formulate my own, then, only then, digital technology comes in and should be a faithful servant to help us reach where we want to go. I stress this sequence because very often, especially in the propaganda coming from certain specific sources, is the other way around. It seems that technology is a means, it's not a means, but it's an end in itself. So, it's a long, complex topic, and in order to respect the time that was given to me, I will just stick to the core. What is the core of education? And I think it's important to clarify this when we talk about open educational resources. What is the actual core of education? Where education actually happens? Where education actually works? And I would say that this is the core of education. Actually, what we're doing right now here. So, people together in the same space interacting. This is the core. It's not the only way of doing education, but it's the core, which has been around for millennia, and is the one that, up to this moment, is the only one working for large numbers. Okay? If we want to have millions and potentially billions of people educated, it has been proven so far that unless there is the human interaction in a physical space, it doesn't happen otherwise. And I can provide you many different quotes and lots of numbers, but I just remind you two key facts. This is a very old quote attributed to Socrates, to Plutarch, to Yeats, to many other different people, but apparently the original quotation comes from Plutarch. The mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting. Okay? And when we talk about education, actually many people, when they talk about education, they have this idea that, on the contrary, education is information transfer. You have to bring something from here to here, and it's not. Of course, that's part of the process, but what really matters, what really makes education work, is when you light a fire. And how you light a fire? You light a fire, the ignition happens only because of human interaction. And so the human interaction can be of different sorts. I will stress the more important, but the ignition happens mostly. There are few exceptions, of course. There could be the person that self-ignites himself or herself, but broadly, if you want to educate an entire population, is through interpersonal relationships. And the relationship, of course, is student-professor, student-teacher, and that's the first kind of interaction that comes to mind. But we often overlook the interaction among students. One thing that people that talk negatively of lectures, they tend to forget that lectures means not only the interaction between a professor and a student, but also a number of students that get together a certain day of the week at a certain time in the same place, and they interact also among each other before the lecture, during the lecture, after the lecture. And also let me remind that I've been in charge of the libraries here at the Politecnico, so I'm fond of reminding of the roles of libraries and librarians. Also the interaction between students and librarians that can also be a way to ignite that fire. So what about educational material, broadly speaking? I put it in quotes because educational material is the expression we use today, but of course is much older. Well, we could say that university was born on educational material, around on educational material, okay? They didn't just call that, with this very technocratic expression, educational material. the first universities, like University Al Qurin in Morocco, Al-Zahar University in Egypt, University of Bologna, the 9th century, 10th century, the 11th century, all of them were born around this, around the book. So first manuscripts, and then from the 16th century, printed books. But this leads us to a question that many people outside the university don't clearly understand. And even people talking about open educational resources don't clearly understand. We had books, and before books we had scrolls. Why just not studying the book? Why just not studying books? Why do we need even professors? Why do we need an institution like a university? You know, maybe you only need libraries, and people go to the library and read books, self-ignite, and everything. That's all you need. Actually, the answer to these very basic questions, why not just educational material? Or thinking about the digital revolution, why not just YouTube videos? Why not just MOOCs? Why just not slides with a voiceover? Okay? Why not just that? All these wonderful new ways of spreading knowledge that we have in this current age. Well, actually, an interesting answer that I found while working on my book, I found it in a book about the universities of the Italian Renaissance. This amazing book by a very well-known historian of education, both schooling and universities in Italian Renaissance, Paul Grandler. And if you browse this book, there is a section about the professor, okay? And I found it extremely enlightening, and so I have quotations, it's just a few quotations, explaining, trying to answer this. Why just not studying books? Why professors? Why university? Okay, this is what Grandler reminds us. And these 3 points that you will see in this quotation comes straight from letters and documents of Renaissance scholars. So this is the beginning of the section. Says professors were the most important part of the university. Prominent scholars attracted students with high enrollments, especially students of noble status built on reputation of the university. The qualities, careers, salaries, and movements of professors matter both to themselves and to university. Fine. Academics, communal officials, and students agreed that the ideal professor should possess 3 qualities: an acute intellect, a good memory, and a fluent and forceful delivery. First one, the able professor could explicate a passage or text subtly and convincingly. He worked his way through the maze of commentaries, resolved contradictions, refuted opposing views, and arrived at a satisfactory solution. This ability was prized because professors lectured on texts on which many previous scholars had written, and a professor needed to surpass his current lecturing on the same text. Moreover, the ideal professor explicated a text in such a way that even students of modest abilities could grasp the meaning. Okay? So it's not just reading the text, it's not just the book, it's going far and beyond in the way that was described. Second, the good professor possessed a trained and well-stocked memory. He was expected to be able to recite passages from memory in order to prove his points. A good memory also helped him to lecture in an orderly manner. And paradoxically, a capacious memory helped create spontaneous teaching, which university culture prized. Spontaneous, not like slides, like mine. Students didn't want a professor to read his lectures. Someone who did was a Dr. Cartaceus, a paper doctor. At the end of the 16th century, the Venetian government forbade professors at Padua from reading their lectures under pain of a salary reduction of 20 ducats. Okay? A prodigious memory helped the professor to lecture without notes. One senior scholar advised future academics to develop the capacity of their memory at a young age, and he urged colleagues to exercise theirs daily. Memory was an essential tool in the pedagogical arsenal. Third and last but not least, the good professor expressed himself fluently and forcefully in good Latin. He needed a strong presentation in order to imprint the principle of his discipline on the minds of listeners, especially the slower students. The professor should not have to search for the appropriate Latin word. Good students would be offended if the professor hesitated or made mistakes, wrote one professor. He had to deliver his lectures with enough eloquence and energy that his listeners would remember the points. If a professor speaks only languidly, one student groused, he might as well send a servant in his place to read his lecture. Okay? And this last point to an often forgotten fact: the lecture is also a live performance. Okay? Now, so these are all an articulated answer about why professors and why university, why just not books? Because they found more than 1 millennia ago that having these professionals that would elaborate the text and then present it to the students in the way we just described, it was effective, it was useful, it would ignite the fire, it would make life easier for students, and eventually it would provide better education. Yet, of course, educational material obviously matters now as then, and in fact, we find books and libraries at the heart of universities, even today. And therefore, having said all this as a preamble, let's focus, and then you will spend the rest of the week focusing even more on this, about the digital revolution, and so about the open educational resources. It's a fact that I do not want to diminish or undermine, that there are multiplication of channels thanks to the digital revolution. There are multiplication of formats, slides and lectures and MOOCs, etc. And thanks to the internet, a worldwide reach. All these, the first two, to some extent, were possible even before the internet, but it was expensive, it was difficult, and the third one was essentially impossible before the internet. So these are profound changes that we have to cherish and use. However, let me remind you that the digital revolution should not become something that encourages the replacing of teachers with screens. Not only because I care about my job, but because it has been proven that the replacement of teachers with screen actually hampers education. And if you go back to the early 80s, when for the first time there was a lot of talk about computers and e-learning, etc., with the spread of personal computers, a very wise journalist at Forbes magazine actually said, let's be clear that what we are risking is to have traditional education with real professors, with small classes, etc., for rich people, and screens for poor people. 1984, okay? And this is exactly what we are still now, even more than 1984, running the risk of going to. So rich families will send their kids to wonderful preparatory schools, and everybody else will have to be happy with a YouTube video. However, on the positive side, of course, open educational resources and the sharing of information is about sharing among teachers, so I can find out materials of a colleague at the Politecnico, in Italy, in Europe, all over the world, and build on what he or she has done on a certain topic. Yes, it's about providing multiple sources for students. We know also by experience when we were students, and we are still or are students to some extent. We know that maybe a certain topic presented in a certain way is not effective, but presented in a different way turns out to be effective. So the multiplication of educational resources does help students that find it difficult to understand in a certain format, but might understand with a different format. And yes, of course, it's about reaching new kinds of students. Thanks to the worldwide reach, definitely educational resources online can help us reach students that cannot attend a physical class because of disabilities. They live in rural areas. They live in disadvantaged conditions because they cannot study, because they have to work, etc., etc., etc. All true and important. And also, a bit more subtly, yes, it is about letting people, many different kinds of people, colleagues, future students, companies, citizens, public administrations know more about your teaching. So open educational resources, if implemented at the institutional level, it's a powerful instrument of transparency, but not transparency per se, but transparency is a way of enhancing mutual understanding. I was listening many years ago to the colleague who was in charge of the open courseware at MIT, and he said, after a few years, we have discovered that the internal transparency of the open courseware project is one of the greatest unexpected benefits of the project, because professors in engineering find out that by looking at the material that professors at the business school were doing something very interesting, and therefore we sparked collaborations that otherwise would not have happened. And that's the point. All these are wonderful ways to promote collaboration with colleagues, collaborations with companies, collaboration with external entities, etc. One point that I want to stress after many years also looking at open access, or access to public, to scientific publications, is that sharing, be that of a scientific publication for open access, be that educational material in this context, if properly done, takes effort. So one huge risk, and is that one of the reasons why we haven't seen so much progress in open access, for instance, is that we have not taken properly into account the effort it takes. Therefore, if we want to do seriously open educational resources or open access, there needs to be substantial support. Otherwise, what we're seeing is that both open access and open educational resources run the risk of being yet another task for teachers and professors with no increase in resources. So I have to do everything I've been doing before, but the time is always the same. The resources, the support, the help is always exactly the same. And this is a recipe for actually not getting things done, or getting them done poorly or in a limited fashion. Therefore, if you want to do both open access and open educational resources, we have to be serious also in committing resources. And if we look at the famous example like the open courseware at MIT, that, believe me, was a huge amount of resources behind that project. We're talking about more than $100 million. Therefore, and I conclude, the digital revolution, which is where I started as a computer scientist, is definitely an opportunity. So it may help to enrich and expand the possibilities of education in many different ways, and you've already done a lot of work, and you will spend the week exploring how to do it, and all of us know how this can be very effective. However, and this is my very simple point in my talk, we have to keep in mind that we want to preserve and enhance in all possible ways the core of education. And open educational resources, if done properly, will help to preserve and expand and enhance the core of education, which is human relationships. So whenever we do open educational resources, in whatever way, we have to think, how is this to help a human relationship with a student, with a colleague, with somebody working in government, with somebody working in a company, etc. If we keep this as our sort of northern star, then open educational resources are set on the right foot. Thank you.